I'm Jonathan Larson with TYT Investigates, and we have a new story out this morning by investigative reporter Tiwa Chang. Tiwa got a hold of an internal document from Morgan Stanley, which included audio of a meeting back in April between Morgan Stanley and Akin Gump, lobbyists from Akin Gump, one of the biggest K Street firms there is. And essentially the gist of the story is that the lobbyists are envisioning a bailout for fossil fuels in the coming coronavirus stimulus package in exchange for giving Democrats renewable aid for the renewables industry, possibly in the form of tax credits. So that's up on our website at tyt.com/investigates. And we're still working on other stories based on the information in there. So I hope you'll check us out. Subscribe on Facebook. Our Facebook page is also TYT Investigates. Follow us and like us, on Facebook. Subscribe here at YouTube, and you'll get all these stories as we publish them and as we offer commentary on them. Today, for today's edition of TYTI Daily, I wanted to share a few quotes, some of which you may have seen from Christie, the Republican former governor of New Jersey, who was in a podcast yesterday with Dana Bash of CNN. And I wanted to read some of the quotes here that they published. I did not actually listen to the podcast, but they wrote up an article on it. So they were talking about the rising estimates for the American death toll from coronavirus. And they were talking about that in the context of whether or not we should now be reopening. And I hope I remember to say this again, but according to CNN, as of Monday, yesterday, more than half of states had lifted aspects of their stay-at-home orders, meaning more than half of states in the United States are now pulling back, despite the fact that there's no evidence that we're at a peak. It does seem that our exponential growth has tapered off, but we are plateauing in the cases of new deaths and new infections, which means the number is continuing to grow. It's just not growing any longer at an exponential rate. This is not when you ease back on your restrictions. Let's get into some of Chris Christie's quotes. Quote, "Of course, everybody wants to save every life they can." Can you hear the but there? But the question is, towards what end, ultimately? So I was told by the pro-life party that the end, right, the end of saving a life is to save the life, that the life is the point. I was actually raised not to be a pro-lifer, but even as a non-pro-lifer, even as someone who supports reproductive rights, I tend to think that life has value in and of itself. And so I find it a very telling remark that he seems to, his calculus about life seems not to take life as an axiomatic good, but only a value in relation to something else. And in a way, that's not horrible, right? The idea that life ought to be lived for a higher purpose, that's a potentially noble aspiration, depending on what you choose as your higher purpose. Chris Christie gives us some inkling of what that is. Quote, "We've got to let some of these folks get back to work, because if we don't, we're going to destroy the American way of life in these families, and it will be years and years before we can recover." So when we talk about the American way of life in these families, what are we actually talking about? Because for decades, the American way of life was basically staying at home. And maybe you made some stuff, and maybe you farmed, right? But for the most part, people were social distancing. They spent, if you lived in Minnesota in the winter, it was not unusual to go months without seeing other people. I'm making some of this stuff up, but you take my point. I'm just saying you don't need to share the thesis about how, social interactions in Minnesota in the 1840s were actually blah, blah, blah. It's fine. I stipulate you're right. But when he talks about the American way of life, what's he actually referring to there, right? What does that mean? Because it used to be, and I've talked about this before, it used to be that the American way of life, sorry about the camera, the American way of life could include a broad range of economic situations. You didn't have to necessarily work full time, right? You could afford a cheap little joint where you hung your hat. Maybe you did odd jobs. We used to have people who would do nothing but travel, right? They would go from town to town, and a very, very small number of them were serial killers, folks. Very small number. But they would go to town. They would do odd jobs. They would wash dishes in a restaurant or something. They did not work 40 hours a week. They did not file, I always forget, W-9s or whatever it is, their IRS forms. They didn't have social security numbers. That was an American way of life, but that's gone. That's gone. You cannot do that anymore. So now what the American way of life is you have two options. You go to work for someone else's brand, or you're an entrepreneur with your own brand. You are your own brand. Your middle initials are now TM. That's what we've come down to. And that's what he's fighting to preserve. When Bash pressed Christie, I'm reading now, on whether people would be able to accept reopening in light of a new Trump administration model predicting about 3,000 daily U.S. deaths from coronavirus by the beginning of June, Christie responded, quote, "They're going to have to." And he's right. What choice do we have? Christie was asked on Monday what his messaging would be to the American public if he were president, and he gave what I thought was an admirably honest answer and a not so admirably horrific, monstrous answer. Quote, "The message is that the American people have gone through significant death before." True. Then referring to the World Wars I and II, he says they were examples of, they were things that, quote, we've gone through it, meaning significant death. We've gone through it and we've survived it. Not true. When you die, you do not survive it. That is what dying means, and that is what surviving means. If you die, you have not survived. So what he's doing there is he's bifurcating the we, right? When he refers to we, he's referring to the people he knows, the economy he knows. And then he says, we sacrificed those lives. And that, I think, is the most telling part of all, because it was a sacrifice. But it's also the bifurcation between the we and those lives is super honest and super helpful, because it shows us exactly how they're thinking of this. And I don't say this a lot, but there was a tweet from Chuck Schumer yesterday that I wanted to read, which goes to this point of we. Schumer writes, quote, "You know how the White House knows that it's safe to hold a press conference? They test the reporters. What do they do before President Trump meets business leaders? They take temperatures and administer coronavirus tests. Why isn't there a plan to do the same thing for the country?" And that's where we really get to, because there's an answer. That's where we really get to what's going on here and why we have to do this in their eyes. They don't talk about it, and Bash doesn't ask him, but the reason, they're right when they say we have to go to work eventually. And they're right when they say there's some principle at stake. The question is, what is that principle that people are going to die for? And it's not the principle that the economy is great and so, and it's the engine of American progress and all that stuff. And so therefore it must go on, because that could have happened regardless. The real principle people are going to die for is that we shouldn't ever, ever use our collective power as a government to force companies to do something they don't want to do. So the Defense Production Act, which is the emergency measure that the president can implement to say, for instance, you have to make masks and you have to make tests and you have to do contact tracing, and we'll reimburse you even. That's the real principle here. Because if we had those things, which the president has, right, as Schumer pointed out, testing for him and anyone who gets exposed to him, that's why he could reopen. If we really want to demonstrate the principle at stake here, then let Trump start reopening his own economy without anyone around him getting testing, right? Let him start going back to his rallies, right? Where are those rallies? Where is he shaking hands with total strangers across a rope line? Where's that? The real principle here is that we were fine after 3,000 people died on 9/11 with utterly sacrificing the individual liberties of others, right? We decided, you know what, we're going to round up these people who look brown in a Muslim way. We're going to just toss them into holes. We're going to go kidnap people in violation of international law around the world. We're going to set up a massive regimen, a secret totalitarian secret police to go kidnap people, take them to extrajudicial, meaning, haha, you can't find us so I can do whatever we want, black sites, and then torture/murder people who had not even been convicted, let alone charged in court of a crime. This was done on a systemic, global scale. And to their credit, a handful of libertarians said boo a couple times. What we're talking about now is 9/11s every day, but those same people, and it's the same people, who were happy, utterly decimating lives and the freedoms of individuals who weren't part of their we. The principle they're willing to have you die for is that no one should tell 3M what to do. And I don't have a spiffy little way to button that up other than it's infuriating and it's obscene. And I should add, by the way, that Democratic governors are going along with this, including some Democratic icons and heroes, right? Gavin Newsom is doing stuff in California. Phil Murphy is doing stuff in New Jersey. I don't know exactly what Cuomo's doing in New York, but he's not exactly been perfect on this either. And not surprisingly, New York is, far and away the worst state so far. And the possibility of essentially commandeering these companies and making them do the things we need to do in order for their companies to get back into business doesn't even seem to be an issue. Okay, let's see what you folks have to say. I've blathered on long enough. Gira Brown says, JL, I hope it's not the Soylent Green economy yet. Well, that's the analogy kind of here, right? Is that, and I've talked before about how we've separated into two economies, and the one at the top has essentially come to see the rest of us as a resource, if not physical, then in our labor and in our capital, a resource to be mined and extracted. And that's what I mean by the Soylent Green economy. There's very little meaningful philosophical difference between deciding we're going to eat some people and we're going to knowingly expose people to a deadly virus. Just because you don't eat the folks you expose to a deadly virus doesn't add a moral dimension to it outside the arguably not really a moral aspect of revulsion. This is something I was talking about the other day, I think with my brother, about there's actually a partisan difference in what we consider to be elements of morality, right? And some people consider revulsion, if you're grossed out by something, if you're squeamish about it, then you associate it with being morally bad. There's nothing inherently morally bad about eating a dead person as long as that doesn't, knowingly bother other people. But the fact that they take offense aside, it is not inherently an evil thing. However, killing them by exposing them, I mean, I don't remember how the people in Soylent Green died, but in theory, this would be worse than Soylent Green, right? Because we're not even saying, the issue isn't even what we're going to do with these people. The point is we're going to kill them. Imperator 1 says the video and audio quality is very bad today. Well, that's, I'm not sure if you were here yesterday, Imperator 1, but it was even worse yesterday because I couldn't even get on. So what I did was I took off the Wi-Fi on my phone so that I wouldn't be reliant on the crappy Wi-Fi and instead be crappy on the satellites overhead. So I apologize for that. I'm not sure what a long-term solution is. Okay, I'll just have to muddle on, I suppose. I'm not sure if I should yell, speak more clearly, speak more slowly. Weena Jensen says, yesterday there was no stream in chat, so this is an improvement. I'm glad I managed to set the bar that low for you guys. Sorry about that. Diamond Dog 13 says, sorry I'm late, teleconference, good day all. And just so you know, there's no such thing as late, right? You don't have to be here live for it. Although it's always fun to see you in the chat, Diamond Dog, thank you. Tamara Nelson says, I was just watching The Rising and Mark Cuban suggested suggesting people be put to work cleaning, tracking, and monitoring COVID cases. Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure that Franklin Delano Roosevelt came up with lots of ways to simultaneously provide people with incomes that they sorely needed and also address social ills, right? And to improve the society around them. What did we do? Like for the $2 trillion we spent, I think, plus the $4 billion that we loaned, if I have the numbers correctly, we just wrote checks to businesses. We could have done, it would not have taken that long. And my guess is someone had an idea, a plan for exactly how to do this that totally got shelved. But it should not have been that hard to either pay companies to do the things that we needed, or just pay the individuals directly to do the things that we needed. And certainly at a minimum, you make it a felony for a company that takes any of this money to lay anyone off during that period. Weena Jensen says, charming guy, Christie. I no longer desire to have a beer with Christie. Oh, someone just hit us with a super chat, I think. Or it's just a, love each other. He hits us with $10 and says, thank you. Well, thank you, love each other. I gotta say, I'm not sure, I apologize, but I don't recall seeing you in the chat before. So that's a hell of a way to make an entrance. Thank you so much for coming by and joining us. And I'll give the spiel I always give whenever anyone kicks in money, which is, please don't feel bad if you kick in money, especially now, right? This is a hard time. The fact that you're giving us your time, that you're sharing, a lot of you share our content, you amplify it, you boost it, you get other people who might enjoy it into our ranks. All of that helps us as well, and all of it counts as support, and all of it for real engenders my gratitude and TYT's gratitude. And I should add, makes possible reporting like the story you saw this morning from Tiwa Chang at tyt.com/investigates. Okay, let's see what else. Lisa Tenzawa says, your dissection of the speech is so helpful. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lisa. That's very kind of you to say. Tamara Nelson says, I agree we don't have enough testing, never have, and I fear never will. And another bifurcation of the economy that's going to happen, right, of course, is that white collar / higher paid employees, they don't need to go back to work. They, including they can work from home, right? It's people who make a lot less, who we allegedly support because we bang pots and pans out the window for a couple minutes every night, woohoo, right? Those people, they're the ones who are going to have to go back to work. And by the way, when they reopen their economy, I've talked about this before, what they're now saying is you're on your own. Not you're free, right? But you no longer have a platform to stand on. You can be free, but you're also falling. Free falling, if you think about it. So, meaning, if I force you to stay at home as your government, I force you to stay at home, I now take on the obligation to make sure that you can still eat, that you are not going to get evicted, right? I have that federal obligation. When I say, no, you don't have to stay at home, now I'm no longer obliged to make sure you don't die. Also, if I tell a municipality, a state, a city, whatever, that you as a business cannot open, I'm now obliged to make sure that you too can survive because I'm the one stopping you from conducting business. So if you still have to pay rent, if I'm so stupid as a government that I don't suspend that, if I still have to pay property taxes, pay for my utilities, all that stuff, if I didn't freeze all of that stuff or pay it myself, if I didn't come up with some way to address that, then you, the company, are going to go out of business if you can't. But if I say, we're open now, oh, you don't have customers? Well, that's your fault. You screwed up. So you're on your own. That's really what a lot of this is about, is the government saying you're on your own. And that's what Christie was talking about, was that libertarian ideal, which is that the good people, the freedom of the good people, must never be infringed in any way. And my response to that is basically, okay, how about this? You wherever 3M's headquarters is, you don't order them to do anything. What you do is, at the driveway, at the entrance to their headquarters, you put a toll booth. You set up a toll booth. So if they want to come in and out of their property, because it's their property, man, they can do whatever they want, it's their property, and also I'm 8 years old. If you want to use my public roads to get in and out of your sacred property, there's going to be a toll. And by the way, the toll is going to be 2 million masks a day. So now you've got your libertarian principles and I've got my masks. Imperator 1 says, I think we will get more tests now that there's more test production, but we didn't start early enough. But also, Imperator 1, it's not just that we're not starting early enough, but if it's not concerted, right? If it's not universal, if you test half the population on a Tuesday and then everyone mixes up, what do you know on Friday, right? So it's not just enough to have the masks. It's not even enough for states or regions to have enough masks. Excuse me, tests I'm talking about. If you're not implementing those tests in a strategic way, they're irrelevant because their results are moot as soon as people walk out into the street, right? It's this whole phobia, it's this anathema towards anything that smacks of collective action, even if, and the polls tell us this, even if everyone wants to do it. Forget the gun nuts showing up at protests. Real America wants to do it. Lemon Lime says, I just started watching and you're talking about eating people? In fairness, I think putting Soylent Green in the title of my video counts as a spoiler warning that we're going to have a cannibalismophobia here. I mean, a palooza, cannibalism palooza. So I apologize for any dismay, lemon lime. Lemon lime, yummy. But you were warned. You were warned. Okay, what else? Joseph Murphy has piqued my curiosity by writing, people committed suicide in Soylent Green, then the remains were processed. That's interesting. I'm curious now about the specifics there. Thank you for that, Joseph. Andrea Jorgen says, the lens looks like it needs cleaned. It's just fuzzy. You know what? It looks that way to me too. I wonder if I did something to it or maybe just touched it. I apologize. Maybe it's just been a while since I cleaned it. Sorry about that, guys. I will certainly clean it for the next one. Kalita says, is JL on tomorrow? So Wednesdays and Fridays are have been TYTI days, and I'm hoping we're going to have another story up tomorrow. It's actually one that he and I are working on together, but I don't know whether, I don't know. Wednesdays and Thursdays are TYTI day, but I don't want to promise anything one way or the other for tomorrow. Oh, love each other says, hi, Grammy Bernie Bros. Love each other, who kicked in 10 bucks earlier. Thank you very much. It turns out is not new to the chat. Used to go by the name of Grammy Bernie Bro, who I certainly remember. Hello, Grammy. And thank you again. Andrea Jorgensen says, if all these businesses got money to keep their employees, why are there so many unemployed? Andrea, I hope you're running for president. Because, yeah, you think? I mean, they had to fight with these companies, with the Republicans, just to prevent the money from being used for stock buybacks. It's crazy. It's crazy. But it's not ideologically inconsistent, and it's not a cartoon evil. It's a lot more insidious of an evil because it doesn't walk around twirling its mustache, and it paints itself as freedom. And it's right in a childish, infantile sense that it is freedom. You know, if you take your 2-year-old out to the park and allow them to crawl onto the railroad tracks, you have maximized that child's freedom. And no, I'm not saying that adults are children. I'm just pointing out that freedom is not a universally desirable thing, right? I'm trying to think of examples from game theory, but I'm thinking about the game of chicken thing that I think about a lot. But the point I've talked about before is that there's a real meaningful difference between autonomy and choice. Or I'm not sure, I should formulate this better. But autonomy basically says, do whatever you want. And choice, or options, if you want to put it that way, essentially envisions a collective, some degree of collective action, which might involve some compulsion, like paying taxes. But the net outcome is actually having more choices than pure autonomy, right? Because with pure autonomy, anyone can do whatever they want, but what they can't do is, for instance, go to the moon, because there's no rocket ships, because no one pays taxes to support the rocket ship. So in a way that is ideologically horrifying to libertarians, but is intuitive and almost simple to grown-ups, if we agree to pay some price, then we all will have more options. And that's true of all of us, including the billionaires, right? The billionaires back in the 50s had to pay a price of a top marginal tax rate in the 90s, meaning they paid 90% of all the income they made over a certain amount. And they had more choices, right? Because there was more of a functioning society then. They had the choice, well, not they had the choice, but their country could go to the moon, for instance. Their country could do a lot of things that we can't do now. Those billionaires, they have to travel on the same roads we do, and the roads are in crappier condition. So they might have more money individually, and maybe that means they themselves can buy a rocket ship, but they still can't go out on the roads and expect to find them free of potholes or whatever, however you want to work that analogy. Anyway, all of that is my long-winded way of saying, yes, lemon lime, I'm talking about eating people. Weena Jensen says, JL's going to have a barbecue later. He asked for a recipe for dip. I actually already have a recipe for dip. It is a very 70s recipe. It involves sour cream and onion soup mix. And I actually cannot eat food anymore because I've put on, I think, about 15 pounds, no joke, since this whole thing got started. Tamara Nelson says, we all need to buy the big package of U.S. Postal Service stamps. You order online and they will deliver to you. I would love to know what people are doing for Mother's Day because I don't know what to do. Ooh, sorry about the story you're sharing there, Katie Kane. Weena Jensen says, excellent impersonation. Excellent. I'm not sure who you think I was impersonating. I didn't mean to impersonate Chris Christie. Maybe it was just the added 15 pounds made it seem like an impersonation. Ian Sutherland says, I keep looking at the deaths per million stats and look at Belgium at 692. United States is currently 212. That sounds to me like a ton of deaths to come. Well, but it also, Ian, I think that's, thanks for sharing that information, but I also wonder whether or not we already have those numbers, only they just haven't been called coronavirus because they're not testing every single dead person for coronavirus. So I've seen some reporting out there that says that, you know, from actuarial tables and stuff like that, we generally have a pretty good idea of how many people die on any given day in any given month of the year based on various factors, weather, you know, climate conditions, air quality, things like that. So if our normal range of deaths per day is, let's say, 5,000 people die on a given day, and instead we have 10,000 people dying, but we only have 1,500 of those people showing positive for coronavirus, that still leaves 3,500 deaths, statistically speaking, unaccounted for. So it could very well be that Belgium is simply better at keeping records or at testing their dead people, which the smaller you are, in theory, I suppose, you know, it depends on scalability. But I would imagine it would be easier, even if you're only Belgium, to test all of Belgium. Diamond Dog says, if there's no stream tomorrow, we can go back to our Fig Newtons discussion. You can always go back. Imperator 1 says, we should do what Britain is doing. Pay 80% plus of wages as long as needed, so long as companies keep their people on the rolls. Right. But that kind of draconian is not the right word, but that kind of aggressive, in a good way, that kind of aggressive response makes a lot more sense if it's coupled with and if it is facilitating wholesale testing, strategic quarantining of people who test positive, asymptomatic included, contact tracing, where and when it makes sense to do, all of that stuff. So, and it's the lack of willingness to do that. One thing that I did want to share is that we talk on both the left and the right about what the other side wants. This is why they're doing it. This is what they're trying to accomplish. And if you see in the story this morning, TYTI got access to audio of what was intended to be an internal conversation between lobbyists, including lobbyists for the oil industry, and oil industry strategists and analysts at Morgan Stanley. These are people who, if they're not running things, they at least take regular meetings with the people who run things. And one thing that struck me, it's not in the story, but this struck me, was that even they don't have a sense that there is a they. In other words, for instance, when they talk at one point about why there's been no fossil fuel bailout, right? We've had three and a half, I forget, packages already of economic aid. And although there have been a few things on the margins, a couple deregulatory measures, things like that for the oil industry, we have not seen one big, massive, comprehensive, surefire, prop them up till 2022 rescue plan. And what these people said, I was going to say guys, and then I realized, yep, it was all guys. What these guys said was that there was no unanimity about what to do. In other words, all of these people were oil industry people. They all had the same goals, but even they don't have a unified strategy, so they have so far gotten nothing done. Nothing big and substantive. And that to me was kind of telling. These are the powers that we talk about when we talk about the powers that be. And they don't have a unified strategy. They don't have a unified plan for getting there. So when we talk about the broader Soylent Green economy, I think it's important to avoid saying that Christie and company want people to die. This is their plan, all that kind of thing. I think the left has said for quite a while that the Soylent Green economy is a very predictable outcome of these ideologies. And that's true, by the way, even without a pandemic, right? All a pandemic does, a pandemic is like the internet, in that the internet didn't create anything new. Information was always exchanged. It just went much more slowly. The internet made it move much more quickly, much further, in ways that changed the way we communicate. But it's still just communication. The pandemic does the same thing. It just accelerates and increases the same forces that we're all prey to, right? We just don't notice it in our usual lives because our culture, our society has normalized it, right? People die preventably all the time, but they're not doing it, for the most part, they're not doing it in piles of bodies on the street. My fear / half prediction is that all of these, the disappearance in July, August, September, the disappearance of the existing relief packages is going to mean that rents and mortgages and taxes and utility bills and all the other extraction that the other economy does, the economy that won the war, all of that is going to start showing us casualties on the streets, like literally people dying on the streets, not just in the hospitals. But as I said, we already have that. People die on the streets of America. That happens. That's already a thing. All the pandemic does is strip away the excuse that the powers that be used to say, which was that was their fault. They didn't plan ahead. They didn't plan for their retirement. They didn't become their own brand. They didn't disrupt their town norms, right? They didn't innovate their way to a sandwich. The coronavirus moves so fast, spreads so widely, that fault is no longer a moral issue here. That's what's changed. That's part of what triggers the collective response to it. But it's the same forces that we have every day, all the time. And I don't remember what my point was, but I'm pretty sure I made it. All right. My throat's starting to go, guys. Oh, wait, I'm going to get a couple more in here. Gira Brown says, JL, my turn to be philosophical. What's the difference between wanting us to die and knowing we're going to die and not caring? Only semantics. I disagree with that. If you want someone to die, that's potentially going to motivate you to take steps to make sure that it happens. If you simply know it's going to happen and you don't care, then you are simply passive about it, and you might, for instance, not interfere with life-saving efforts. If you want someone to die, you're going to interfere with life-saving efforts, given the opportunity, all else being equal. Katie Kane says, the wealthy pay to be insulated from the sadness of others' lives. I see that a lot, Katie, as I get older, one thing that's interesting to me is when you're young, when you're kids, a lot of those economic lines aren't always super clear to you. You don't necessarily know, oh, that kid has a lot of money, that kid doesn't. And I might just be obtuse, I get that. But in college, certainly, I didn't notice that a lot. The big difference being that you might know that someone had a fancy car or a car or a fancy computer. But if it wasn't, ostentatious, everyone lived in a dorm, right? So you didn't have housing necessarily to differentiate. But as I get older, I can see the separation. And it's not just in terms of the things they have, but it's also, oh, rich people stratify not just because they have more money, but they can, the people they hang out with are the people who can afford to do the same things. Why are they going on vacation together? Because they can afford it, right? And even if you're not so close that you might vacation together, just the conversations around what should we do? Where should we go out to eat? Should we go out to eat? Those kinds of conversations, if those are fraught because of the underlying economic disparity, you stop having those conversations. And those kind of conversations are the brick and mortar, maybe just the mortar, of friendships, right? The planning, the socializing. And if you stop having those conversations, the friendships start to pull apart. The bricks, the center cannot hold. The bricks separate out. And that's bad for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is that the rich people, now severed from the non-rich people, no longer have the reality check of individual human beings as a counterforce to the narratives that their confirmation bias encourages them to buy into about people who don't have money. So thanks for getting me all philosophical. I'm going to wrap it there. Please go and check out our new reporting today from TY Chang at tyt.com/investigates. In the meantime, and we'll be back tomorrow and every weekday here at youtube.com/TYT Investigates Reports. If you don't already, I hope you'll subscribe, and that way you can be with us every day, every weekday at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time, and usually live, usually me, but sometimes TY Chang, sometimes on tape. And in the meantime, between now and tomorrow, I would ask you to take care of each other, take care of yourselves, and I, for my part, will be cleaning the lens on my camera. Sorry about that, guys. Although, to be honest, I'm not sure this is the kind of thing you want going on in high resolution. Bye now. Be good.